All right. What I want to do today is briefly go over the arms race as a cause of World War One. We've already looked at the alliance system. We've looked at some of the impacts of imperialism with regard to this topic. So, what we'd like to do is to see how the development of the arms race really intertwined with these other factors, and thus perhaps could be considered one of the causes, long-term causes, that is, of World War One as well. As we can see here, um, basically the size of the military force of most European powers increased in the years prior to World War One. This graph illustrates the growth of the German military, but I think it's pretty safe to say that most European powers were going through a similar sort of process, an expansion of the size of their respective militaries. As we can see here, this is a graph illustrating the combined size of the Russian and French military versus the German and Austro-Hungarian militaries. We need to be careful here a bit though, because again, as we've noted earlier, the power and potential of the Russian military was perhaps exaggerated. We've already looked at issues like the lack of preparedness with regard to the Russian military, the inability to supply them with sufficient military weapons, for example. And we've also looked at the problems that Russia faced with mobilization due to such issues as poor infrastructure, poor communication, and just the overall size of the country. So again, let's take these with a grain of salt, but I think the point otherwise is important, that there's again a shift upwards in terms of military power among the great imperialist nations of Europe. Similarly, military expenditures also increased. You can see there's a generally upwards trajectory during this period, both within the Triple Entente and Triple Alliance nations. Conscription. During this time, most European countries adopted conscription as a way to ensure that their military power would grow. Almost all countries conscripted men for usually a 2 to 3 year period, and once they finished their period of conscription, they would be placed in the reserves. So if an actual war broke out, they would be able to be called up. And thus, when we look at the size of each country's military, we have to distinguish between the peacetime military versus the combined peacetime and reserve forces. Britain was the only country during this period that did not adopt conscription, and the reason was pretty clear. Britain was a maritime or a sea power, had always depended on its navy, and thus, as a seabound country, did not feel it vital to have an enormous army. Here's some statistics about mobilization strength, and again, this reflects the size of the reserve forces as well as the peacetime army. And as we see here, Russia indeed had the largest army, followed relatively closely by Germany and France. And again, Great Britain's military was quite small. Its army was quite small, that is. France had a problem, however, and the real issue for France was that its population was growing quite slowly, and thus the availability of young men to fight was far less than, say, countries like Germany, which were expanding in population quite quickly. And so for the French, they had to find a way to get around this. And one of the things they did after the Second Moroccan crisis was to lengthen the time period that a young man had to serve in the military, had to serve during his conscripted period. So it went from 2 years to 3 years. And again, this was a way for the French to keep up with the expansion of the German military. Even though Russia was less developed economically than the other major European powers, countries like Germany feared Russia. Following the 1905 Russo-Japanese War, the Russians made a concerted effort to begin to rebuild their military forces. Then in 1913, they adopted a program called the Great Program, which also which also had the goal of expanding the Russian military force. Now, really, the potential of Russia as a country to field a great military was great. And the thought was that once Russia became more developed economically, that its potential to be the leading military power in Europe was there, simply because of the size of the population. And so Germany really feared Russia as a future military power. And some historians would go so far as to suggest that this was one of the reasons why Germany felt the need for a war in 1914, that if they waited longer, Russia would develop its military further, and then it would have been impossible for Germany to defeat France and Russia. But that's just one idea. That's not necessarily agreed by all historians. The importance of mobilization was significant. You could have a lot of troops, but you had to get them to the war front. And you really, at this point, depended on railroads to move your troops to the war fronts. Now, in the case of France and Germany, they had well-developed mobilization plans, they had good infrastructure, good railroads, so it was relatively easy for them to move their troops to the war front. On the other hand, this was much more difficult for a country like Austria-Hungary, which again did not have quite the developed infrastructure, and it was a serious problem in the case of the Russians. Again, Russia was such a huge country, had poor railroads, and thus mobilization was a real issue and a real potential problem. As I said earlier, and I'm kind of repeating myself here, Germany really feared the combined potential of the French and Russian forces, and again, that really refers to the potential of the Russian forces. And thus, in order to avert a future military disaster, Germany perhaps recognized the need to defeat France and Russia before that military power became too great. Here we have some statistics showing the percentage of eligible men in military service. Again, in the case of France, you see a very high number. That again reflected the fact that France had relatively fewer young men than a country like Germany. So again, we need to look at the statistics closely here. During this time, the arms industry also expanded. Companies like Krupp in Germany, for example, Skoda in Austria-Hungary, increased their production of military armaments. In fact, these arms industries became an important aspect of the economy, providing both profit and jobs. Indeed, some historians, like Hobsbawm, for example, have argued that the growth of military stockpiles in the early 20th century helped to cause World War I. So again, what he's saying is that there was a connection between these arms industries and the outbreak of the war. That you have these big piles of military weapons growing and growing and growing, and basically at one point they have to be used, and if they're not used, it's going to really hurt the arms industries because they have to keep producing to make profits. It's a little bit sinister in some ways, but that's one idea that he has put forth. What were some of the causes of the arms race? Increased military capacity. Again, the tie between economic growth and militarism. We've looked at that earlier. Increased communication. So as one country produced new military technology, new military weaponry, other countries could easily, or relatively easily, attain information about that. There were also technological advancements during this period which accelerated the arms race. More efficient explosives, for example, like nitroglycerin, more accurate rifles, the development of heavy steel artillery with long-range capacity, the development of other technologies like the Dreadnought, which was a huge naval ship, first developed by Britain in 1906, followed by things like primitive submarines and primitive airplanes. So all of these technologies really changed the nature of war. The effects of these weapons, basically what they did was they created a situation which allowed for a long, drawn-out defensive war. Because of the nature of these technologies, they tended to strengthen defensive strategies as opposed to offensive strategies. And thus, even though at the beginning of the war most people felt that any conflict would be relatively short, what happened was essentially stalemate, particularly on the Western Front in the French region in northern France. Okay, so anyway, that's a brief overview of the growth of the arms race as it relates to the causes of World War I.